Chapter 2. Because your heart was tender. Now here comes a comfortable message to good Josiah, that he should be taken away and not see the miseries that shall befall his people. The double cause of which is set down here. Because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before God. 1. The inward cause. The inward is the tenderness of his heart and humbling of himself. 2. The outward cause. The outward expression of it is set down in a double act. Rending of clothes. Weeping. Because you have rendered your clothes and wept before me, after which comes the promise, I truly have heard you, declares Yahweh. I will first remove one doubt before I come to the tenderness of Josiah's heart. Some may ask, is there anything in man that can cause God to do him good? The answer is, no one thing is the cause of another, but all come from the first cause. Tenderness of heart may be some cause of removal of judgment, but God is the cause of both. For they all come from the first cause, which is God. So these words contain rather an order than a cause, for God has set down his order in things, that where there is a broken heart, there shall be a freedom from judgment. Not that tenderness of heart deserves anything at God's hand, but because God has decreed that where tenderness of heart is, there mercy shall follow. As here there was a tender heart in Josiah, there mercy did follow. God's promises are made conditionally, not that the condition on our part deserves anything at God's hand, but when God has given the condition, he also gives the thing promised. This is an order which God has set down, that where there is grace, mercy shall follow. For where God intends to do any good, he first works in them a gracious disposition, after which he looks upon his own work as upon a lovely object, and so gives them other blessings. God crowns grace with grace. The heart is not meant the inward material and fleshy part of the body, but that spiritual part, the soul and affections thereof. In that it is said to be tender or melting, is a borrowed and metaphorical phrase. 3 properties of a tender heart. Now, in a tender heart, these 3 properties concur. Number 1, a tender heart is always a sensible heart. A tender heart has life and therefore sense. There is no living creature that has life and sense to preserve that life. So a tender heart is sensible of any grievance, for tenderness presupposes life, because nothing that does not have life is tender. Some senses are not altogether necessary for the being of a living creature, such as hearing and seeing, but sensibleness is needed to the being of every living creature. It is a sign of life in a Christian when he is sensitive to difficulty. Therefore, God has planted such affections in man as may preserve the life of man, such as fear and love. Fear is that which makes a man avoid many dangers. Therefore God has given us fear to cause us to make our peace with him in time, that we may be freed from inconveniences, even from that greatest of inconveniences, namely hell. Number 2, a tender heart is pliable, yielding to the touch of anything that is put to it, and does not stand out as a stone that rebounds back when it is thrown against a wall. A tender heart has life and sense, and is pliable as wax, is yielding and pliable to the disposition of him that works it, and is apt to receive any impression that is applied to it. In a tender heart there is no resistance, but it yields presently to every truth, and has a pliableness and a fitness to receive any impression, and to execute any performance. A fit temper indeed for a heart wrought by the Spirit. God must first make us fit, and then use us to work. As a wheel must first be made round, and then turned round, so the heart must be first altered, and then used in a renewed way. Number 3. A tender heart is yielding. A tender heart, so soon as the word is spoken, yields to it. It trembles at warnings, obeys precepts, melts at promises, and such promises sweeten the heart. In all duties concerning God, and all offices of love to men, a tender heart is thus qualified. But hardness of heart is quite the opposite. For as things dead and insensible, it will not yield to the touch, but returns back whatsoever is cast upon it. Such a heart may be broken in pieces, but it will not receive any impression, as a stone may be broken and will not be pliable, but rebound back again. A hard heart is indeed like wax to the devil, but like a stone to God or goodness. It is not yielding, but resists and repels all that is good, and therefore compared in the Scriptures to the adamant stone. Sometimes it is called a frozen heart, because it is unpliable to anything. You may break it in pieces, but it is unframeable for any service, for any impression. It will not be wrought upon. But on the contrary, a melting and tender heart is sensible, yielding, and fit for any service both to God and man. Thus we see plainly what a tender heart is. The supernatural disposition of a true child of God is to have a tender, soft, and melting heart. It is the supernatural disposition of a true child of God, and the frame of soul of such is one to be tender, teachable, and serviceable. Out of all necessity it must be so, because naturally the heart is of another temper, a stony heart. All people by nature have stony hearts in respect of spiritual goodness. There may be a tenderness in regard to natural things, but in regard to grace, the heart is stony and beats back all that is put to it. Say what you will to a hard heart, it will never yield. A hammer will do no good to a stone. It may break it in pieces, but not draw to it any form. So to a stony heart all the threats in the world will do no good. You may break it in pieces, but never work upon it. It must be the almighty power of God. There is nothing in the world so hard as the heart of man. The very creatures will yield obedience to God as flies, and lice to destroy Pharaoh. But Pharaoh himself was so hard-hearted that after 10 plagues he was 10 times the more hardened. Therefore, if a man does not have a melting heart, he is diverted from his proper aim, because God has placed affections in us to be raised presently upon suitable objects. When any object is offered in the Word of God, if our hearts were not corrupted, we would have a correspondent affections. As judgments we would tremble, at the word of warning quake. At promises we would with faith believe, and at mercies be comforted. As directions we would be pliable and yielding, but by nature our hearts are hard. God may warn and promise and direct, and yet we may remain insensible all the while. So all Josiahs, and all that are gracious out of necessity, must have hard hearts.